Hello guys, yet another beautiful chess day. I'm glad we're doing part 2 of this series of identifying your opponent's resources. And without wasting time, I really want just to take you guys through what we did in part 1. And we discussed a few concepts about identifying your opponent's resources. And in part 1, we insisted on the importance of paying attention to your opponent's resources. Most often, we chess players analyze our best moves, but we fail to see our opponent's best moves. And if in case your opponent's best move seems to be better, you're gonna lose the game. And that's the whole point about becoming a better chess player. If you can be able to identify your opponent's strongest moves, or rather identify your opponent's resources. What does your opponent have that could give him an edge against you? If you can identify that early, you're going to be able to become a better chess player and actually have a better game than your opponent if you consistently do that in every position of the game. So now in part 2 of this series, we're going to study another element of identifying your opponent's resources, and this specifically going to discuss the process of elimination. So more often than not, when you're playing a game of chess, you'll find yourself in a position or in several positions where you're trying to identify which move to make. So for instance, you have several moves to play at any one point, but you want to determine the best move to play. Sometimes accurately calculating the consequences of your move is actually very difficult, and sometimes it's even unnecessary. So it's easier to convince ourselves that it makes sense to first eliminate the bad moves and at least remain with the noticeably weaker ones. Anyway, it's something I can only explain if we do some few examples. So this approach to making these decisions, or rather this decision making process, is what we are calling the process of elimination. So I'd like us to do a few examples to illustrate this point, and I hope this is going to become clear even as you're trying to identify your opponent's resources. And now let's go into it. Alright, so let's analyze this position that occurred between Coach Noi and Gipsilis in some zonal tournament in Tallinn in the year 1967. So let's look at this position. If you look at the black knight on c5, it's under attack by the pawn. And apparently this is black's turn to play, and in the actual game the queen moved all the way to a4. So queen moved to a4, and this was a very interesting game because in this position is supposed to play knight to e1. And definitely, if you look at the repercussions of that move, it's a very strong move because now we have some discovered attack by the bishop to the rook on a8, and the knight is still on pre, meaning it's still under attack. So in case we have this kind of a variation, if black takes, white takes the queen, and now black has to rescue one piece, meaning he has to lose a piece at this point, which means then the best move by black is not playing queen to a4, and it really means that this knight on c5 has to retreat somewhere. But now the question that I want us to answer and shall help us in understanding this concept about elimination is, where should the knight on c5 retreat to? Where should we put it? You can try and just look around the positions available, the best move you think should be played by black. So let's start with knight playing to d7. What if knight played to d7? What is the best move by white here? So if knight plays to d7, then white will just proceed and play knight to g5, having a threat on mate and also attacking the rook on a8. And in case of course black takes, because it looks like the obvious move, then simply bishop takes a8. And please notice that if queen takes a8, rook takes the knight on d7, and obviously we don't want to see this line. It's gonna be bad for black, and in this scenario it wouldn't really work for black. So definitely knight to d7 loses material. So what if the knight did not go to d7 and played to a move like a4? a4 looks very wrong, I mean, for obvious reasons. Definitely the best move by white here would be simply just to play knight to d4. Knight to d4 does several things. One, it still has that discovered attack on the rook, and for example black plays a move like rook to c8, then you have this annoying strong move by white, bishop to c6, attacking the queen and having a double attack on the knight on a4. Definitely we shall not put the knight on a4. So let's not even analyze knight going to e4. That's nothing to discuss about. So if knight plays to b7, we simply play knight to d4, attacking that knight on b7. Say for instance black plays rook to c8, looks like the best move. Just move queen and play like to e2. Good thing we are still having an attack on the knight on b7, so possibly the knight could play to d8. Then queen goes to a6, attacking the knight, attacking the pawn. So say rook plays to c7, knight goes to b5, rook goes to d7, rook takes, queen takes, knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes, queen check down there. And of course if you look at white looks better in this position, so I think that's why it wouldn't make sense to play the knight to b7. So let's analyze this one more move we've not discussed, and that is knight to a6. So knight to a6 seems like an interesting move by black. Definitely do several things, attacking the pawn on b4, and kinda looks like a good counter by black. So let's see what happens in this position. So in case of this scenario, a3 follows, move pawn to a3, protecting your pawn, followed by rook to c8 by black, attacking our queen. And black looks okay here because now this knight can always relocate and find a good square. Or even for instance, instead of rook to c8, the rook will also go to d8. And after rook d8, rook to c1, then knight back to b8 and can always relocate into better squares. However, in the actual game, Victor Korchnoi does not cope with the small task of elimination. Quite sad, because what really happened is after the move into a8, Victor, who was playing white, instead played a very bad move. Of course, one we've not discussed yet, and of course he was supposed to play knight to e1. He instead knight to d4. Now this is a very bad move because what happens from here is going south for white. So for instance, what really happened is after that move, rook played to d8, and it seems like this is lights out for white. If you see keenly now, black has the advantage because this is what happens. Bishop to f3, of course, trying to give the rook on d1 some good support because it's now hanging, or rather in case of some exchange it will be hanging. Then of course queen takes c2, and of course if black takes, that exchange happens. Bishop takes the rook on d1, and now it's black's turn. Of course, knight to d4, having a fork on the two pawns, and in case for example f4 is played, bishop takes the pawn, and in case of a move like 2, bishop check, and of course this is good for black. He's a pawn up. And when you compare two continuations that are equally attractive at first sight, it often makes sense to try and refute one of them, then choose the other by the process of elimination. So this situation usually occurs a lot in chess. This is something that keeps happening, and if you don't discern a position, you're gonna find yourself in a position like what Coach Noi did. So it simply really matters where you put a specific piece. Basically, what this lesson is about is all about finding the best move by elimination. So eliminate all the bad moves and remain with at least one or two good moves to play, and of course decide which works for you. So let's look at this other example. On a common position happens a lot in chess. This is something that's so simple. A neat card between Saidi versus Popovich just recently in Gausdal. So if you look at the rooks, this is just a simple rook ending, but very good for you to understand the concept of elimination. And it's actually white's turn to play, and it seems like there's a lot of pressure on the f5 pawn because the rook and the king are attacking that pawn. So the only way for white to get back compensation for his pawn on f5 is definitely to attack the pawn on g7. So the simple question is, how should white attack the pawn? So basically this is what happened in the game before we discuss how to defend on that move. And apparently white played the move rook to g8, attacking the g7 pawn, but he was shocked by this interesting continuation, which was rook to e1 check, king went to f3, and the amazing rook e7 was played, and alas, this pawn on g7 is protected and the king is attacking the pawn on f5. Very painful move, because in this scenario he lost a pawn, a second pawn, and now black is 2 pawns up. So of course, based on that, the best move by white was definitely play rook to a7, and in case rook f4 is played, check, king goes to 3. This gives an easy draw by white, because in case the pawn is captured, rook takes the pawn on g7 and the game is very drawish. So I hope you see the importance of eliminating. So whenever you choose a move over another, for instance this position, it was just a question of how do I attack the pawn on g7? Do I do it on g8 or do I do it on a7? Those are the kind of questions you need to ask yourself and look at the bigger picture. Definitely black had the resource of, in case of a check, he can always go back, protect his pawn on e7 in case you went to g8, and definitely just get a better game than white. Let's look at one more example as we close down the class. And in this position, it's white's turn to play. White looks so good, 2 pawns up, has some good king opposition, and of course, so it looks like white can just simply toss a move like g7 and go for an easy promotion to the g8 square. However, that will just be an elementary draw. I hope you all see that, because in case that happens, in case a move like g7 is played, then bishop e6 comes, check, and of course the king has to play to a move like take the bishop, and if that happens, then king takes the pawn, and it's quite obvious in this position black gets a good draw in his favor, because the pawn on h cannot successfully promote on the h8 squared. Considering the bishop has the wrong color, the pawn cannot easily promote on h8 if the bishop is light squared. So amazingly, the best move by white here would be king to g8, a very clever move. Of course, black has to respond with some interesting moves. So for example, he might want to sacrifice his bishop for this g6 pawn and try get a draw, but white plays an interesting move, which is g7, sacrificing his bishop, because at some point black will be on a zugzwang. So let's see how this goes. So of course takes h7 check, king goes to h8, and now it's black's turn. Of course this bishop cannot leave that diagonal because now this pawn will promote. King plays to g6, white plays h4, king goes to h6, and now after h6 it's lights out for black, because now he can no longer go to g6 supporting his bishop, and he either has to capture this pawn or lose his bishop. If he removes the bishop, then the pawn promotes, and this is how white should have played and gotten the win in this game. So one thing I just want to summarize this class with is, one thing to understand about elimination is that most good moves only found through that process. You have to eliminate some bad moves, remain with the good ones, then choose the best continuation from there onwards. So don't panic, it takes time to get good moves. All you need to do is take your time, relax, look at the possible alternatives, and definitely you're gonna get there. It's so painful to lose a game when you have a winning position, and especially when the obvious continuation was in sight, but you chose to focus on just your good moves. Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate you watching the video. In case you like the class, you can always share, subscribe to my channel. See you in our next class. Coach Titus here from Inspire Chess, and have a good and lovely chess time. Bye.